Yes, I'm very happy here to, for the first time, bring on screen uh, Matty David, in my circles, more widely known as the amazing Matty, who for the last almost 3 years or something like that have actually been half of the Nordic Animism team, and now you're on screen here for the first, hopefully not the last time. So welcome to Matty David, and what will we be talking about today, Matty?
We are going to talk, we're going to talk about Mormonism, which is the background that I grew up in. And we're also just going to talk about sort of transitioning out of Christianity and what that might look like and some of the nuances I think that get lost a lot of the time in when we talk about deconstruction and I find it's rare that when deconstruction is mentioned it's talked about in the context of moving from one religious perspective, deconstructing, and then to another religious perspective, as opposed to moving into sort of a non religiosity.
I think you're going to have to just explain what is deconstructing here, because it's a very specific term that is about transitioning out of. Uh,
Yeah, deconstruction. Well, you could take a really academic approach to it and talk about sort of post-structuralism and
yeah,
stuff like
forget
that, but
about Derrida or all
we're
that
not going
stuff.
to do
What?
that. We're not going to do that. Colloquially, deconstruction is the process of moving out, usually of Christianity, or it's mostly referred to in terms of Christianity, but not exclusively. So what that process looks like, and sort of the systematic deconstruction or taking apart of previously held beliefs.
Yeah. And we're going to get back to that, but just to
Yes.
perhaps kind of that would often entail some sort of atheism, perhaps, or moving into some sort of general criticism of religion. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I would say that in my experience with it, sort of in public discourse, it's almost always implied that it is atheism that is at the end of that rainbow,
Yeah.
which is valid. That is just as valid as anything else, I guess. But for me, I kind of went down the deconstruction path into agnosticism or atheism or religious
Oh.
criticism, and then
It's a
somehow,
happy end of the rainbow, though. Atheism, hooray, hallelujah. For some
yeah.
reason, it reminds me of this absolutely brilliant Norwegian anthropologist, Thomas Hyland Eriksen, who at some point he wrote a book about the meaning of life. And the background to the book was that he had gotten drunk with one of his friends the night before, and they had talked about the meaning of life. And they had agreed that the meaning of life was three things. One was having children, the second was believing in God, and the third they couldn't remember the next day. And none of them had children, and none of them believed in God. So anyway, so just a little spin off on atheism there.
Yeah, yeah.
But
But anyway, so I went down, I think, what is a very classic path in that regard, and then somehow someday I ended up back, on the flip side of things, and became really interested in Norse paganism, but also eco spirituality more widely, and then kind of animism, sort of as I'm going to say a final result, but also a very general result. Um,
I remember you told me that at a point where you got really interested in the Nordic Animist channel was when you watched some of the possibly the weirdest videos that I ever made about viewing the god Odin as a kind of holy ghost that is activated when you engage the Snorri Sturluson and all those things. These were videos that I had actually been advised to not publish because they were too weird. but
they
but
they were they were really weird, but I almost think that served you in a way. The when I became, well, we'll get into this maybe a little bit more later, but when I had, gone down into sort of this very atheistic mindset, and I wasn't completely satisfied. I wanted to investigate, paganism, but I was so scared about it being like complete mumbo jumbo, or being super super right wing, and I wasn't interested in going down either of those paths. So I resolved that I was going to begin to look at it academically, and found that completely overwhelming. But I also found it somewhat dissatisfying. I remember I picked up one of the first books I ever picked up on paganism, and it literally started with, nobody really believes there are multiple gods or anything. And I wouldn't say that at that point I
Fuck you.
well, kind of,
Yeah.
at that point I wouldn't have been willing to say, oh yeah, I'm super spiritual and I'm a pagan in this. But I just got kind of offended because I felt like I had been insulted out of the
Yeah.
gate. Or my intelligence had been insulted out of the gate because I was considering looking into this.
Yeah.
So even though I had started looking at things academically and started to read a lot more about archaeology and things like this, I still wanted to find someone who had a religious element. And I found your channel, and because you were a historian of religion, I felt that things were put into a lot more context, and so, through various context clues, I was like, okay, this guy probably has some sort of religious practice. Uh, I'm not sure what it is, but I got the sense. So that video, that was the Odin is the Holy Ghost video. That was the video that convinced me to reach out and get involved in working with the channel, weirdly enough. Even though I did think you were crazy. And
Cool. Yes.
there have been times since
Great. Great.
where I'm like,
And
oh,
nothing have convinced you otherwise ever since.
yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Never have I been sitting with you after you said something and gone, so anyway.
Cool. Let's get into what Mormonism actually is, because I think that a lot of Americans would probably have a much clearer idea of this rather special shoot on the tree of Abrahamic religions. Can you sort of outline just a little bit what Mormonism is?
Yes. So Mormonism was founded in a period of Protestant revivalism. So it sort of comes from a Protestant strain. It has theological differences. But if within a Mormon context, you would say that you're a branch of Christianity that was founded in the States or revealed in the States during the sort of early mid 19th century. That has since grown quite a bit over specifically the US, but also in South America and other places as well. So the main outline of Mormon doctrine is, you have the Bible, but you also have something called the Book of Mormon, which is an additional scriptural texts that tells the story of Jews who had traveled to the Americas and became the ancestors, basically, of what is now the modern indigenous people there. And they have, their own religious role to play, and there's lots of prophecies and stuff like that. So a branch of Christianity, whether or not everyone agrees with that, I think is very much up to debate. I'm not sure exactly what various religious scholars say. I've looked at some surveys, and it always kind of tends to be its own category. But that's the basics of it. I grew up very much identifying as a Christian,
As a
Mormon,
Christian.
but as
Yeah.
a Christian. So
Yeah.
and vaguely Protestant in a way.
But Mormonism has some very, very distinct features
Yeah.
compared to other kinds of Christianity. I mean, I can understand why many Christians would probably be a little bit like, that ain't Christianity, because there's a lot of elements in it that are just totally not what you'd find in a lot of normal kinds of or more standard ways kinds of
Yeah.
Christianity. Like, for instance, the fact that there's a prophet called Joseph Smith, and that he met an angel called Mormon and revealed
He met quite a
basically.
few people or
Okay,
beings.
yeah,
Yeah, so the founding prophet, which um, was part of the restoration of the priesthood that was broken apart when the original apostles were killed, right? So that is a restoring of those particular priesthood organizations. And so Joseph Smith had again, this is church narrative, was visited by Christ and by God, and then subsequently instructed by various angels from the
yeah.
Americas, and was then made a prophet and given, instructions and revelations and books, and eventually reinstated what Mormons consider to be, the one true church,
Yeah.
which is a phrase
But
you hear a lot.
there's also something about ritual, and like there's a whole ritual system in Mormonism that is, would
Distinct.
probably call it uncharacteristic in as a form of Christian. It's yeah, distinct is probably a there's one central temple. There's initiatory processes, and like often when you talk to people about Mormonism, they will say Mormonism is the craziest shit, and they start talking about you know, weird things that might be
Yeah.
fringe or might not, it's but can you tell me a little bit about the kind of the ritual system of Mormonism?
So Mormonism differs from Protestantism in that it is very ordinance heavy.
What's an
These are
ordinance?
ordinance is a ritual.
Yeah.
It's basically a ritual. In I don't know if there's like actual academic differences between these two words, but as I understand it, an ordinance is just a ritual. It's a ceremony. Some are reoccurring. Like the sacrament is an ordinance or a ritual, right? You do that every Sunday.
Mm.
But we also have a temple or temples. We have multiple temples, and some rituals correspond to the temples or are done specifically in the temples for the temples. For example, we have baptism for the dead is an ordinance. So you are baptized in proxy for deceased people who are not baptized in life. And
That
that,
alone would
I know.
probably get you burned if you were in the 13th century, and and you were in a part of Europe where there was a strong Catholic Church present,
Well, it caught
like
the Mormon shot.
baptizing dead people.
So yeah. Yeah, so you're probably right. So we have baptisms for the dead, which is um it's not really a secret ritual. It's done inside a temple. The temples are restricted based on your eligibility. So that's something that you start doing when you're 12 years old, and you continue to do it for basically the rest of your life,
You
on and on,
That's
as
baptizing the dead, and these dead are ancestors.
not exclusively,
Okay.
but that is very normal for them to be.
Yeah.
There are, I think, a lot of Mormon families who are so invested in genealogy and doing that type of temple work that they don't have any ancestors left to baptize. Like they've
Okay.
gone as far back as there are records.
Yeah.
Um,
So you can say that like that in itself is like whatever you think about it, I mean, there might be a moral problem in from some perspectives in baptizing baptizing your ancestors,
yeah,
but whatever you think of it, it's definitely an ancestral engagement, or
very
often
much.
perhaps an ancestral engagement.
Yeah, yeah. Is it a form of worship? They would probably definitely say no.
Yeah,
Is
but
it? Kind of. I don't know. But
well,
engagement's a good word for
if
it.
it's a communing with those ancestors, but
That
I don't
might
know.
be limited, but you could maybe argue that. So that's one ritual that
Yeah.
is very common, and then you have other rituals that are closed. They're secret. I have not gone through all of them, so I can't and I won't speak to the specifics of them, but you have something called an endowment, which is, as I understand it in sort of our Nordic animism language, is an initiatory ritual, right?
Yeah.
It's the giving and taking of vows between you and God, and sort of solidifies your position in the church as a church member. You are held to higher levels of accountability once those vows are made, and those are secret. You don't speak about those publicly, and it's also, it changes, or it can change quite a bit about how you continue to live your life. For example, you begin to wear garments, which are it's clothing that goes under your clothing. And those are sacred and have specific uses and certain levels of
That's also some stuff that people will sometimes say when you talk.
magic
They
underwear.
wear magic underwear, dude.
Yeah, that one's,
Yeah, man, that's great. But I think that this aspect of secrecy is also interesting. That there is ritual aspects that you don't talk about publicly.
yeah,
That's also not like in the way Protestantism works. You
nope,
don't find it. Almost nothing. Perhaps very small, things here and there, but almost nothing compared
yeah.
to, for instance, like proper animist technologies who would have significant kind of constraints and communication in different levels and so on.
I think there are. I'll just state for the record that I don't think that Mormonism in its current form, maybe it was a little bit different in the early church. There's some debate. Mormonism in its current form is not competent with these types of technologies, in my
Mm,
opinion, compared to, different indigenous groups and stuff like that. But there are things that are similar. The secrecy is
mm,
one of them. Um, there's ritual name giving. You're given new names that are only used in specific religious purposes.
mm,
That's something that you sometimes find in various cultures, and the identity is meant to change.
mm.
The identity of the person is meant to change,
Yeah, yeah.
which
Identity changing. Yeah,
I
cool.
think freaks a lot of people out, and I think that's I think that's why there's a lot of there's a lot of cult accusations, and
Yeah.
which may have some grounding.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Well, I think also like cult accusations are sometimes rooted in the way that modernity perceives the spiritual or the religious as very decidedly other. So
yeah,
cult accusations, that's not because a lot of abusive and illegitimate shit doesn't take place in cults. Yeah, it does. But the idea of what constitutes a cult, such as secrecy, that is necessarily something that's morally reprehensible, for instance. I
yeah,
don't I think that is something that grows out of modernist rejection patterns. Um,
yeah, yeah. If I were to call Mormonism a cult in like the bad way, then it wouldn't be for those reasons. I think there are other more convincing.
I will also say, like, as a historian of religion, like calling a religious system a cult, and then that means that there's something manipulative and exploitative going on in there,
Mhm.
that's actually not a particularly good lingo to use. It
Yeah,
it like the concept cult means something else.
yeah,
Uh, Manipulative and abusive and exploitative stuff does take place, and sometimes it takes place in religious situations, but the word cult is
yeah.
weirdly sort of misapplied, I think, when it's kind of smacked onto that. But let me just move ahead to something else because you left Mormonism. Like, what is it about Mormonism that made you
Drove
think?
me out.
Yeah, that makes you
um,
make you think that there's something else that I want in life, or this I'm looking for something else.
you know, I For me, it didn't. There's no one definitive moment where I thought, fuck this, I'm out. It's something that sort of
You kind of
unfolds.
generally got to fuck this amount.
Yeah, more or less. Um, and it's not linear either. One year it was fine, and then the other year it wasn't. And I
Mm.
didn't. Well, have I officially left? That's actually a question because, as far as the church is concerned, I'm still a member. I'm still on their records. I
Well, if
still
you don't edit what we just said here, then you just publicly said, "Fuck it, I'm out. Fuck this, I'm out." So,
get. I'm not.
but I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well,
Consider this.
yeah, consider this my resignation. But you do need to formally resign. Um,
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
it's for again, how much legitimacy you give to these things is maybe questionable, but um anyway, it wasn't linear. It didn't
Mm.
happen in one particular streamline. I think that for me, the biggest thing, well, maybe two and a half things. The biggest thing for me was the censorship of information, not the secret temple stuff per se, but the restriction of information from the outside, where it is very common to be very heavily discouraged to read things that are anti Mormon, right?
Mm.
And what that label is applied to, I think, is quite general. And because I think there's actually relatively few anti Mormon things out there. There are people that are disgruntled, 100%. I think there are also, stupid people who make up stupid things. But
Mm.
um, there were many times in my adolescence and into my early adulthood where, you'd bring up a question or you'd bring up, I don't know, something about the scriptural canon, for instance, and say, this doesn't look right. What's with this? And that could shut down so quickly,
Mm.
or can be shut down really quickly. Uh, academics, there are Mormon academics, there are Mormon universities and professors within the church system
Mm.
and stuff, and you see instances of where these academics really have to tiptoe around that sort of credibility and not
Mm.
offending the church,
Yeah.
which is problematic, I think, culturally.
But you also find that in other
Yeah, exactly. This
religions,
isn't.
probably.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Christianity has sort of rested in it's very close to modernity, like
Yeah.
geographically or demographically. So that means that Christianity has probably, faced a lot of criticism. But if you look at Islam, for instance,
Mhm.
I think that there are certain positions about saying stuff about Islam that are difficult to they're difficult to voice in academic circles because they face too strong resistance. For instance, the
Yeah.
idea, which I think is an idea, I had to have zero background to basically evaluate the validity of this idea, but the idea that Muhammad, the prophet, praise be upon him,
Mhm.
actually never existed. There are some people who say that, and I think it's anyway. It's just to say
It's not necessarily Mormon specific.
no, but there might be levels, of course, and there might be kind of a weight on it. Also compared to, say, if you're living somewhere in America and you look at
Mhm.
how other peoples reflect on the world and spirituality, then you might still feel that there's a heavy load there of
Yeah, I think that again, going back to this sort of discourse around deconstruction, I find that this is a complaint that people often have. It's not Mormon specific. I do think, however, Mormon has such a strong infrastructure compared to other, because it's a very large organization, at least in terms of buying power, if
yeah.
that makes sense. Um, and because of that, it can become very insular very quickly, depending on your circumstances. Um, and there's so much about the censorship of information that becomes morally coded. For instance, Um, Mormonism has a really, it's very anti-sexual, which we'll come back to.
Yeah.
But pornography is a really big no-no.
Okay.
And it was really common when I was growing up, for instance, not my family, but I knew other families who did this, where your computer was not allowed to be in a space that was not public and not facing the rest of the room.
Yeah.
And that yes, it prevents you from watching pornography, but it also prevents you from looking up things about the church that are maybe not savory about the church.
Yeah.
Or watching things that would challenge some of the morals and principles and things like that, or philosophies. So it's small things, as well as big things sometimes, where that's at every level of life,
Yeah.
continually. And I think it's gotten harder and harder to control as technology becomes more available and more normalized. I grew up, I was a child in the early
Yeah.
2000s. Your computer was still on your desk at that point.
Yeah.
It wasn't in your hand in the same way until I was a teenager. So
Yeah.
now it's
And
a
that
lot harder.
physically makes a big difference for how much you can survey,
Yeah,
like
it does.
socially survey.
It does. I've seen, if I remember correctly, I remember there being a court case about an adult woman who lived with her parents still, who was, their family was Mormon. And she found out that he had installed something or bugged something along those lines, where he could watch what was on her phone, um, to morally monitor her. And she's in her early 20s, and so I think they ended up taking it to court. And I can't remember who won, because obviously he's the owner of the house, and I don't know if he paid for the phone service or the phone, the
Yeah.
property and stuff like that. But this isn't something that you necessarily age out of in many ways, including adult men. Adult men are not required, but like, there are different families that, or wives, for instance, say, your computer has to be facing me because
Yeah.
you shouldn't be watching porn. Um, it's that level of policing
Yeah.
across different levels of society. Um, the temples I mentioned earlier, they have eligibility requirements, which are interviews with your sort of leading religious figure in your local group, which is called a bishop. So starting from usually 12, but sometimes 8 years old, you start getting asked. It's a set list of questions, but that doesn't mean that they stick to the list.
Yeah.
And it can get very, very personal very quickly. You
Okay.
know, do you masturbate? What do you think of when you masturbate? So on and so forth. So I had a bishop when I was 14. We were working on my sexual purity at the time. And I genuinely don't think he was particularly creepy. I think he had in his mind good intentions, but it got to this point where he asked me to text him every time I was aroused so that he could send me something to help me disengage from that. So whether or not
Shit.
it's, well,
Yeah.
but that's so normal. It's so
Mhm.
normal. Um,
It's
I genuinely don't.
extremely invasive.
It's, yeah, yeah, that's
Like
part of it.
being a
Um,
young woman and having such a figure of religious authority.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, and there have been active believing members who have pointed this out. This isn't something that is.
yeah.
Uh,
No.
the criticism is not only coming from ex-Mormons; it's also coming from some people inside the church. But there are times where those people who are active believing, church going, their whole lives have been spent in the service of the church, who get excommunicated, who get a lot of a lot of social flack
Yeah.
for voicing those opinions because they're going against the church head.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's I just knocked out my light, but that's fine.
Yeah.
It's it's stuff like that, right? It's
Yeah.
very self-policed or
Yeah.
mutually policed, and that feeds into
So
everything.
So over a period of your life, you say
Mhm.
it was not like a clean break. It was not like you're almost not really certain that you're out now, having like worked for 3 years and basically
Yeah, getting up to everything I
witchifying
get up to.
witchifying people and convincing them that it's probably a good idea to build relation to trolls. Uh, the like, but you you exited. So what is it about uh sort of the animism, paganism complex, which then sort of pulled you in that direction? Or can you talk a little bit about your process with that stuff?
Yeah, I'm still not sure what made the switch turn exactly. I had always been interested aesthetically, historically in sort of the Nordic space.
Okay.
And I think that um, there's probably lots of cultural reasons for that. But genealogy was one of the things that helped
Mm,
drive that. I think, I mentioned that Mormons are very, very into genealogy because we have this complex where we can still engage with, do service for ancestors and stuff like that. And
mm, mm,
and the Mormon conceptualization of the afterlife is very family oriented.
mm,
So it's not like I had an overwhelming amount of Scandinavian heritage or anything like that, but it
mm,
was the
mm.
coolest in my mind. I think there's probably problematic reasons for that, but that's how it began.
It was it the most metal?
Maybe. Maybe. I mean, again, I think it also has a lot to do with like the Mormon self-image. The Mormon self-image is very blonde, very blue-eyed, tall.
Okay.
There's a squeakiness to them.
Squeakiness.
Yeah, which is kind
Wait,
of like
wait, wait.
which is kind of the opposite of the Viking image, but it's still tall and blonde and blue-eyed
Okay.
and problematic, but but
It's it's squeaky, blonde, blue-eyed, and problematic, and
and sort of Viking-y, right?
kind of, kind of.
Um, so anyway, I became interested or kind of started poking around there, and I was really disillusioned quite quickly, actually. I felt like a lot of it was cosplay,
Yeah,
and I didn't have a lot of faith in any sort of reconstruction efforts, or not a lot of faith. Enough for it to kind of like look cool and be cool, and maybe I'd just do it for fun. But I had come from such an intense religious background that
yeah,
just doing it for fun was not religiously motivating.
yeah, 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 yeah. Mormonism ain't a fucking hobby.
No.
Like,
No, it's not.
yeah,
No, not in any way,
yeah.
shape, or form. So, anyway, so yeah, I poked around different things, and I looked at Wicca a little bit, and I looked at this, and I looked at that, and none of it 100% came together for me. Part of that though was a lot of prejudice against New Age that I think is partially unfounded, and you've talked about that on the channel, so we won't get into it too much. Um, it was animism specifically
Partly
though that
unfounded, but not completely unfounded.
well, exactly. I was
Yeah.
like, well, I'm still not those things. So there's I ended up not going with it.
Yeah.
But it was animism or the understanding of animism that I think gave me the vocabulary to start picking apart some of the really um frankly like modernist views I had on certain things where like, oh, that's childish, or that's it's all psychological.
Yeah.
Um which I think sort of healed some cognitive dissonance in my mind because I came from this really religious background. I knew that religion wasn't inherently bullshit in of itself, but um, there were still problems with this version of it. And,
Yeah.
and anyway,
Yeah.
so animism specifically sort of opened up uh, Euro traditional modes into some sort of legitimacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm going to struggle to articulate this for the rest of the interview, but um, but that's kind of how that
Yeah. No, of course.
started
I mean,
opening
of
up.
course, it makes sense to me. You know that
Yeah,
that
yeah,
animism lends gives a legitimacy, a legitimate position to think with
Yeah.
roots religiosity.
Well, since it
So
makes sense to you, why, in layman's terms, as best you can,
please.
why why is it animism that makes those things legitimate as opposed to sort of other approaches to paganism?
I think one approach which is really good comparison with animism, and I've also been, I don't know, ranting a little bit, perhaps I'm also a little bit unreasonable,
Mm,
is the historical approach. If
yeah.
you look at, say, Norse paganism from a historical perspective, then you place yourself in a game where you're looking at something that's very, very distant, very inaccessible, and it's only accessible through really problematic sources, which means that pretty much anything you can say, you can also say the opposite. And that, like, I have experienced when I've been looking at Norse heathens, that they spend a hell of a lot of, at that point, they spend a hell of a lot of time basically deconstructing each other.
Mm,
Somebody said, "Oh, now we're having a Yule celebration," and then you have Facebook threads of people saying, "Oh, that's not a real Yule celebration because we don't know anything about Yule celebrations," which is academically is kind of right if your criteria for validity is history.
yeah.
Animism moves the criteria for validity into a completely different space where the criteria for validity is not this diachrone historic perspective where you need to go back and find something. You can take one element like a contemporary midsummer pyre, and then you can say, is there animism inside this? Yeah, there is. We don't
Great.
we don't give a hoot if people did this 1,000 years ago or what they didn't. There is still animism in there. So that I think is the important, what do you say in English? The Alexandrine sword cut,
I don't
the
know. Oh,
like
cutting the oh fuck, I know it.
the Gordian
The
knot,
Lydia knot?
the Gordian knot.
Gordian knot.
That is a cutting of a Gordian knot where
Yeah.
that releases
Yeah.
a lot of culture to be accessed in animist ways and to become material for inspiration. And I think that particular and then and that is in a sense an academically legitimate way of thinking about whatever. So it's as academically legitimate. It just isn't a historical perspective. It's a different analytical lens. So that's one perspective, I think, of why animism really works. But
Yeah.
perhaps that wasn't what we should be talking about now. But
No, but I mean, even if you're gonna reapply it to a Mormon context, historicity is I think a concern of many deconstructing people because whether it's Mormon or not, they go back into their written texts and there's almost always there is always doubts or illegitimacies or flaws or mistranslations or all sorts of things. And once you start pulling that thread, everything begins to unravel. My deconstruction didn't center a lot around the early church because it just didn't. But I do have seen people, take that route, and I've dabbled in it, and it's really, that the house of cards falls once you start picking at historicity, especially when for in the instance of the Mormon church, they have a image that they want to keep because it's still an organization that wants growth. um Whether that is in like a schemy business sense or even just in like a normal sort of evangelical sense. So maybe we cover up that the founder who said that the reason we had multiple wives was because of practical issues, the fact that he had 40 wives when he really didn't need to. Like, it's these sort of things that if you're thinking from a historical perspective, even just in the process of deconstruction, not in any sort of, not in any concern with academia, it becomes really dangerous really fast,
mhm.
or it just makes everything crumble if that's the approach that you're taking.
And I think it only makes the religious perspective crumble if that rests on historicity. Like, if let me see if I can find a good example. Yeah, let's take the shoebreds. We made at some point a video about shoebreds.
Yeah.
That they're these breads that people have been placing on specific Yule altars, particularly in Sweden around Yule, and they call them shoebreds exactly as the shoebreds that you find in the Old Testament. So where does the practice come from? Is it biblical, or is it just a and I mean, in my view, I really actually don't know. It might actually be a biblical inspiration that just grew into like local culture in Sweden. But if you want it to be a reconstructionist heathen, you could look at that practice one time and you can say it's probably biblical, and then you can throw it out.
Yeah.
It loses legitimacy in that moment. But what if the point is not where it belongs in some trajectory of history, but so at that it's that deconstructive action. If your criteria is, did Jesus actually really say exactly these words in exactly that way? And then you can document that, well, in fact, Luke, the gospel writer, had this and that political position, and you can see that in what is called the Lucan history, that also includes the Deeds of the Apostles, is it called that in English? And then that deconstructs that what Luke says that Jesus actually said. Well, then the whole thing doesn't work anymore. Like, it's only if you need the history as that criteria for validity. But what if your validity is what those shoebreds do? What if your validity is uh what does it channel what Jesus said there, here and there? Then it.
Yeah, no, it makes it makes a big difference. And I've noticed that, I think, as my animist vocabulary or understanding has grown, the kinder I am to the early church, which is a little bit of a crisis for me, because
It's kind of scary, isn't it?
it is a little bit.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not sure I find it compelling enough. But Mormonism has early strains of, like, various sort of esoteric features, but also like
Yeah.
folk religion.
Yeah.
And depending on where you dig and how you dig, I think it is well documented that Joseph Smith was the founder. His family were Masons, and there's influence of Masonry in definitely in the early church, but also into current temple rituals. I've seen somewhere something about how Joseph was actually considered, or his family was into sort of, or were regarded as cunning folk, because, and I think there are arrest records for him, what the locals consider just like con artistry, but using divining rods to find things and find treasure and stuff. There's this whole sort of
And I can hear what you're saying. Like, when we're talking about esotericism and conic folk, then we're starting to move into the general vicinity of badassery, pretty much.
exactly. And this
Yeah.
isn't even starting to get into the weird sex cult stuff, but
Excuse me.
which I don't know. No,
I
I have
think
theories.
we're just going to press the pause button, and then you're going to tell me about what you just said there, because that
Yeah.
sounds fun.
No, I don't think there's actually any basis for that. But
Okay. Okay.
well, but I think I have a strong argument for it being possible. Anyway, but like, you go from this perspective, in my case, you go from this perspective of being really set on the church narrative, which is very squeaky clean, not really Protestantism, but like enough, right? To atheism, because you've pulled those threads of the historicity and other social critiques, and then you end up in this atheism, and become interested in paganism and find ways of understanding that are legitimate, and they aren't complete bullshit. And then you have to go back and look at your original critiques of the church and think, oh, wait, those critiques were rooted in things that I know I'm now wrong about. That doesn't make them right. But I think it does challenge, I guess, the original method of deconstruction. When I see people in the Nordic heathen space who I know came from a Mormon background, I often see them really focused on historicity and really focused on written texts. And I don't know if I'm projecting, but I think I can see the train of thought because I've lived it myself. And you start to be able to build critiques on their current positions or disagreements, at least. It's I think people who have deconstructed often really cling onto that atheist, that agnostic layer of things because it's another sense of surety. Atheism is the strict opposite of this living religion where you can speak with spirits and they're telling you different things and they contradict each other and everything's in relation to another thing and no one's this one right voice.
Atheism can sometimes be this very fanatic and judgmental position that doesn't come through as very, very wise or very sort of
Are you going to use the word
kindness-oriented.
intelligent?
Excuse me?
Is it, were you going to use the word intelligent and then decided that, well, maybe I don't say that?
I don't know. No, I went with wise, but
Wise.
yeah, no, I've always had. I don't know. I also think that that it has it's a bit of a problem the way that it claims science to itself a little bit as if
Yeah.
as if we own that. No, you don't.
I mean, there's nuance in those spaces too, right? In the same
And
way that there's nuance in any space.
most agnostics and atheists have loads of nuance and for sure.
Exactly. But it seems a convenient, but also it's something that's in close proximity for people who feel like their entire world has metaphysically collapsed.
Yeah.
Because everything that they believed is now untrue.
Yeah.
Or not true. So that's an easy life, maybe.
And it's a difficult place to be in, I imagine.
It's not fun.
No, you've probably quite a bit of experience in facing that like deep existential rift or whatever you call it.
Yeah, and like that's not a linear process either. Where it's death is currently my little bit of my existential crisis. In that my perceptions of the afterlife are changing in ways that I find to be unexpected currently. This is a complete tangent, but it's stuff like that. It's stuff that happens all the time because life is not static and different stimuli are introduced and someone dies and you're like, oh yeah, what do I actually think about that now? Because you're not being told what to think anymore. And no matter what that transition looks like, it's a scary place to be. Or can be.
Yeah, and obviously it's scarier the more certainty you come from. Like if you come from a place of death, well, we don't really know what it's about. Then I imagine that it's more difficult to come from a position that has very set ideas about exactly what happens in death and what happens if you were married and if you weren't and if you went through the endowment and if you didn't and so on. But can you tell me a little bit like what is it other aspects of Mormonism that sort of makes for or that we could say they perhaps point into some sort of animism or paganism?
I think the ancestry angle is a very strong contender.
Yeah.
I think that, and you've talked about this a little bit on the channel, sort of, especially the American sort of obsession with ancestry and genealogy, and there are probably ugly sides to that and also very legitimate sides to that.
Mm.
I think Mormonism takes it up a notch.
Okay.
If I am correct, the two biggest sort of family tree companies, organizations, one of them is owned by the church. That's Family Search. It's a church uh, functionality. You don't have to be a church member to use it, but it's designed for doing temple work,
Yeah.
essentially, or for non-members to feed into that knowledge pool so that other people can do temple work.
Yeah.
And I think the other one, oh fuck, I can't remember the name. Is it ancestry.com? I can't remember. One of the other big ones is not Mormon owned, but it was created by Mormon individuals and then
Okay.
later sold to Blackstone. So that's
Shit.
two. I know. That is two of the world's leading ancestry search
Yeah.
functions that are sort of have their genesis in Mormonism.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a coincidence.
No, probably
No,
not.
no.
Yeah.
So I think that ancestry is a big thing. I also think that because so much of that certainty has been lost, ancestry is something that's kind of certain, right? Like, you come from
Mm.
somewhere, even if you don't really know what your cosmological arrangement is or what the afterlife looks like, or, are gods, or are they just energies, or, none of that
Mm.
is,
Mm.
is very sure immediately, but ancestry is.
Yeah.
You know that you come from somewhere, that there were people before you, and in that way you can continue to religiously engage.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
paganism has a very strong tradition. Heathenry has a very strong tradition of
Yeah.
familial bonds and ancestry and ancestor worship and or
Yeah.
veneration, and so I
Do
think
you
that
know?
that's one thing.
Do you know if there's any interface between Mormonism and Spiritism?
I'm not super familiar with spiritism. I know the general premise. I don't know if there's an interface. It
Oh,
sounds
okay.
like something that could have been
Yeah.
touched upon in the early church.
When
Because,
did when exactly in history did Joseph Smith have his revelations and
I
started
believe
to?
the first vision was 1820 or 1823. The church was founded in 1832.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if
I
that's a little bit early for Spiritism.
It is a bit early for Spiritism. I think from the
It's
top
like
of my mind, I think it's a
Spiritism
bit
strikes
early.
me as something Victorian.
Yeah, it's a bit later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the early church especially, and into the modern church, but in a more structural way, is revelation is still a thing.
Yeah.
Personal revelation was a lot more common in the early church, and now it's kind of become systematized, and
S-
there's distance, I guess. But the early
So
church had room for that.
so how does personal revelation work in Mormonism? Because like when I think about Christianity,
Hmm.
it seems to me that personal revelation has been a bit of a problem in Christianity because these revelations don't necessarily comply with doctrine, and that
Yeah.
means that a lot of them end up being perceived or conceptualized as demonic,
Yes. Yeah.
and with sometimes dire consequences for the poor people who had these religious encounters.
Mm.
Um, but
Um,
uh,
it's I'll tell you how it's perceived in the modern, sort of the context in which I grew up. Historically, again, it's like church narrative versus various historical narratives. So I can't speak to that as clearly, but growing up, for instance, personal revelation is something that is common to receive. All men over the age of like 11 or 12, it kind of depends, um, get a version of the priesthood. And then when they're older, they graduate to a higher level of the priesthood. So that enables them to give specific blessings or become a little bit of a mouthpiece for divine communication, I suppose. On a personal level, you might encounter people who are very invested in dreams, for instance, where you can be communicated with through dreams. But at this stage, it's very limited to only your personal experience. So you might, for example, have a dream where a family member is communicating with you, a deceased family member, or you might get instruction about which life path you're going down next. You're not going to have a revelation that says, well, actually, I'm the next prophet and I need to go to speak to someone about it. Like, that's not going to happen, right? That is restricted to higher authorities.
Yeah.
There is,
I guess if you have that revelation, somebody's probably going to tell you that it's not a legitimate revelation.
Yeah. It's a common trope, and I think this is true in some like other evangelical denominations and stuff. There's a common trope of when you get to a marriageable age, so let's say 19, the guy will go up to the girl and say, God told me that you were my wife. And that's taken somewhat legitimately. I think it's kind of a common thing for women to think, you know what? Maybe you did.
It's a hell of an opener.
It's a hell of a, yeah. And it
or an
must have been
icebreaker or whatever.
Yeah. And now it's kind of the response from women to be like, oh, you were told that? Great. When I'm told that, we can talk. You know what I mean?
Cool.
But so there is sort of this implication that some
so women says that today. That's pretty cool.
yeah. I think I've said that. but
awesome.
There is implied communication there. There's also, you mentioned the demonic sort of things. Mormons don't really believe in demons per se. It's a little complicated. We have our own lore, but there is instruction from the early church that tells you how to navigate encounters with spirit beings, if you don't know if they're good or if they're bad. So there's a famous anecdote, I think it was from Joseph Smith, where if you encounter a spirit, which that spirit is always in the form of a person, if you encounter a spirit and you don't know if it's an angel or if it's a one of Satan's servants, you ask to shake their hand.
Okay.
And one of three things will happen. Either they will shake your hand and nothing will be there, so you're shaking a hand with nothing, and in that case it is one of Satan's servants, because anyone who followed Satan after the initial sort of premortal collapse was never given a body. So they think they have a body, they think they have power, but they don't have power. Power rests in you of having had a physical form at some point. If they refuse and they don't shake their hand or don't want to shake your hand, it's because they are an angel, basically a non-resurrected being. So they were a person, they've died, they're waiting to be resurrected, and they know that they don't currently have a physical form, so they will decline.
Okay.
If they, what was the other one? I think if you shake their hand and they're real, then they're a resurrected being. So they've now been reunited with their body, I think.
Okay.
So there is, there's legitimacy there in that you can communicate directly or be visited directly by non-human forms.
I think there's an interesting aspect there, and that's the physicality. There's something about Mormonism where physicality is sort of there in a way that's also not characteristic for Christianity, but which perhaps seems a little bit more recognizable for like real animist positions.
Okay. Can you give an example?
Like that thing you just said, that you shake the hand of the spirit being that you meet, and if it actually has a body, then that means something, and if it doesn't, then there's I also remember you talking about that there are specific planets that people
Mhm.
would perhaps go to in these sort of, and these were considered to be physical places, actual planets,
Yeah,
or
there's
these.
yeah, the physicalness of them is maybe it might depend on who you're talking to. So the Mormon afterlife is constructed differently than mainstream Christianity.
Yeah,
There's not really a hell.
no,
So because the initial test that would make you go to hell is already happened in the premortal existence. So at the beginning of time, we were all in heaven. We were all spiritual children of a heavenly father, which is God, and also a heavenly mother. But we'll come back to that. My favorite topic. Premortal children. So children created in spirit form did not have a body. God says, "Great, we're going to go to Earth." Or how we're going to go to Earth, how are we going to do this? And then there's that schism between Lucifer and Christ, and the people who follow Lucifer never receive a physical body because they never come to Earth.
okay,
So those demons, fallen angels, whatever you want to call them, I can't actually remember what they're called in Mormon context, but um, those are the only people that are going to go to hell, quote unquote. The rest of us, so anyone who has ever been born, ever will be born, Hitler, Gandhi, everyone included, is going to go to some version of heaven.
yeah,
There's multiple layers. There's three main layers. Those who are on the tippy top of the tippiest top will be able to continue creation. So they will be able to build their own worlds, to continue to procreate, potentially indefinitely, from my understanding. And it's part of that package that you will basically get your own planet. And I'm really sort of uh, doing the Spark Notes version of this, obviously, because there's a lot,
yeah, yeah.
and you know,
But I would say even the complexity of it all, like
there's a lot.
if you asked that is, it has an esoteric feel to it.
Mhm.
That there is this very complex cosmology where souls are processed in different ways, and it has a little bit that feeling of an sort of an animist sort of cosmic
Mhm.
machinery where things work in a very specific way.
Yeah,
Um, Even though it's very like moralist patriarchal, right? So
yeah, and
there's a missing coolness factor.
yeah, it's missing a lot of like animal sex, but to make it like
For
properly,
just to mention one thing, just like from the
yeah,
top of our head,
at the top of my head, it's missing sex with
why
animals.
aren't there any rock carvings of somebody having sex with donkeys?
Exactly.
I'm
So,
thinking about this all the time.
yeah, I'm not welcome back in Relief Society, but that's the women's group. So, yeah, no, they're definitely, it looks different than the average Christianity. And growing up, I did not understand why so many people seem to think that we weren't Christians. The official name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day
Yeah,
Saints. Like, superficially, it seems very obvious that we're
yeah,
Christian, and I would still kind of argue that maybe it fits enough of the criteria. But um,
possibly. Yeah,
when you zoom out a little bit and you start to think about how the afterlife is constructed, and the esoteric elements where not only the esoteric rituals, but there's an esoteric side to the afterlife where certain things have to be fit together in order for you to be exalted in this way or that way, and just the amount of material that is written by active believing Mormons. Many of them have some sort of professorhood somewhere.
yeah, yeah,
The volumes of
yeah.
material that they write, which is batshit, isn't, it's on the esoteric side of things.
Yeah. But I mean, if they might have visionary experiences of
Yeah,
like, if it is legitimate for them to have visionary experiences, and that becomes legitimate religious knowledge if it stays within certain bounds, then it makes sense that there's a high production of knowledge.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
there probably also is in that branch of Christianity, but it's probably just more like speculative kind of
Yeah,
theology
it's
side.
how what is considered canon and what isn't obviously
Yeah.
kind of depends on who's approved it and who hasn't, and why revelations are given at specific times, stuff like that.
But let me mention another thing here. You mentioned here exaltation.
Hmm.
Um, it also seems to me that when you've been telling me about Mormonism, that um,
When I've talked your ear off about this for the last 2.5 years.
well, I've been super interested. I mean, I mean, we're laughing and blah blah blah. I've come to think, wow, shit, Mormonism is kind of cool.
It's the new Kabbalah.
Oh,
Yeah,
I mean, that obviously, I'm not about to,
go
I'm
ahead,
not about
give up
to
your coffee,
convert to
be
Mormonism,
reformed. Yeah.
but I mean, I can see that it produces cool people like you, but like it
Yeah.
seems to me that there's more interface between humans and the divine sphere than in most kinds of Christianity that I'm familiar with. And that seems to me kind of animist leaning. And by the way, it's also something that would often be phrased as cultist. Good night. Just said good night to my mother. Um, it would often be phrased as cultist
Mm.
from the modern Christian perspective if there is too much kind of contact between
Mm.
divine spheres and humanity. It can you talk a little bit to that? Am I right or in that thing?
It's not something that I've thought too much about. I've actually focused more on the distancing between divinity and the
Okay.
average person, and it might just be sort of an objective versus a in it point of view, because these after the main three afterlife categories really affect the ability you have to keep your family structure.
Hmm.
So your family, meaning like your marriage and your children, that's kind of how the family unit is thought of, is dependent on which its legitimacy is dependent on which temple ordinances you have performed and the promises that are then kept. So during an endowment, and again, I haven't gone through the endowment. This part's not like strictly a secret, so I'm not spilling anything that isn't published somewhere.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
um, I haven't gone through it, so I am just going off of memory. I'm just going off of memory here. During the endowment, a man receives a name, which is the name that he will be known as in the afterlife,
Yeah.
or maybe in the premortal life as well. But it's important for the afterlife. A woman also receives a name, but the way that it works is that for a woman to be called into heaven or summoned into heaven or that layer of heaven in the afterlife, she has to be called by her husband. It's
Hmm.
because her husband has priesthood power, whereas she doesn't have the same sort of vocation. So a woman's exaltation is, at least in principle, somewhat dependent on her husband's exaltation. He has to be qualified to call her for her to be called. The children are connected to her, or sealed to her. So your marriage is a sealing ceremony. It binds you in heaven. And then if you're sealed before you have children, then your children are like kind of caught under that umbrella. If your children are born outside of that context, then you need to have a ceremony done where they are connected to you.
Okay.
So um, if something goes wrong in that, say that I'm married to a Mormon man, we go through all the steps sort of in its normal order, right? We have children, and then sometime in the middle of life, he decides, I'm done. I don't want to be a Mormon anymore, breaks all of his promises, is no longer temple eligible. He can't call me in the afterlife. And that means that our family unit will be broken up. Our family is no longer a family.
Okay.
So what you find socially, emotionally, is that people really hold on to that as both the carrot and the stick for staying good Mormons. It's an incentive to stay good because there's this promise of the eternal family. You'll be reconnected with everyone.
Yeah.
Your children will stay your children. You'll see your spouse, your parents, stuff like that. And if you don't keep all of your promises and do everything you're supposed to do, then you will be separated from those people. Those people will no longer be your family. Your spouse will not be your spouse. Your children will not be your children.
Yeah.
And you may not see them depending on where they end up in this order. So on top of that, it also, how you're categorized in these different layers will affect your ability to interact with Christ and to interact with God. So if you're not in the appropriate layer, you don't have a family anymore, and you can't ever reunite with Christ and or God. So emotionally, I understand what you're saying. We're like, oh, in this sort of occultist sense, you're a lot closer to divinity. But growing up, for me, it was always the threat of being distanced from divinity. It
Okay.
was the
Yeah.
idea that
Yeah.
I'm never going, if I fuck things up, I am never going to see not only my earthly family, but like my heavenly father again. You're being
Yeah.
pulled
So
or separated.
there's a very strict patriarchal policing, sounds like.
Yes. I think there are counter critiques or counter
Yeah.
arguments where, a lot of people see God as this, including in the Mormon church and out, as this very wholesome, forgiving, uh, father figure who, finds a way to make everything work.
Yeah.
And if you find comfort in that, and that's sort of the type of God that you picture going to,
Yeah.
then you're right. Maybe it's fine and he'll make everything work and you'll be able to talk about it and work things out. But if you kind of lean more towards an Old Testament God, it's really threatening.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
I can see that.
so yeah, there are women out there, for instance, or men as well, who are like, yeah, my husband doesn't attend church and but I have faith that, when I die, we'll be able to, me and God will be able to talk things out, basically.
Yeah.
And that's how they live their lives. And maybe they don't live in fear.
Yeah.
But I'm neurotic. And I never could think like that. I was always sort of very anxious about
Mm.
that side of things. So yeah, but that's from coming inside of it. I'm not
Mm.
looking at
Mm.
things from the perspective of other Christian groups. So
Yeah.
maybe that fear is already indicative of there being really close proximity.
So would you say that like Mormonism is at a couple of parameters, it's at odds with modernity? Like
Yeah.
it is perhaps sexually repressive, it is perhaps patriarchal. There's some morally problematic aspects of parts of it probably, and but it sounds like it has repressive aspects, right?
Yeah.
But it's also at odds with modernity at a number of parameters,
Mhm.
which could be why people tend to accuse Mormonism of weirdness more than, for instance, they would accuse Jews, Christians, or Muslims of weirdness, right?
I feel like the Jews have been
Excuse
accused of
me.
quite a few. I feel like the Jews have been accused of quite a few things.
You got a point there. You got a point there.
I'm not a big, I'm
And I
not big
also
into
think
God
that
or anything.
like there are some branches of Judaism who I would say they do weirdness pretty convincingly. So
we'll park that.
yeah, let's park that.
That's a different interview.
But there's parts of Mormonism that is not just weird or oppressive or whatever, it's at odds with modernity, and it's partly the reason for these weirdness accusations. Does that kind of match something in animism, paganism complex somehow? Because that is also at odds with modernity.
Yeah, I think that I can only really speak for myself. Maybe I'm sure that there will be other former members watching this, so they can let me know. But I think that for me, it made me a little bit more prone to, or more accepting of looking into, weird pagan stuff, because I was already kind of on the fringes of society.
Yeah.
In a different way, for sure.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like I was sacrificing any cool points from moving from one to the other. I think that, when it comes to things that are, maybe a little, I don't want to keep going back to the whole culty thing, but things like, let me think of a good example. You don't really find this, or at least I don't know of any heathen groups that really do this very much, but I'll say the name thing because we've mentioned it a few times. Mormonism, I always knew, growing up, that one day if I got my endowment, or when I got my endowment, that I would learn my other name.
Yeah.
So the idea of having this other side of myself, or unlocked potentiality, maybe, that was normal to me growing up. And that is also something you see in certain animist groups where people are given different names. I feel like if you saw that in, I know, some heathen group, right, the sort of secular majority would see that and immediately accuse it of being really problematic because it's manipulative, and I'm sure it's part of the bite model. Actually, we've talked about the bite model a little bit. I can't remember if you know what it is, but the bite model is a model for judging basically whether or not a specific group is a cult in the bad sense, cult with a capital C.
Yeah, which that idea makes me go, like, I think it's weird, but cool, go ahead.
But I think it is. I think
model.
it was written by an academic. I think it's not just like some random dude. I think it was a researcher who wrote it. Whether or not, that doesn't mean it's not subject to criticism. But
no, of course not. Yeah.
Anyway, stuff like that, where like, okay, I've joined some group practice, and now I have a heathen name. I don't think it raises the same alarm bells in my head, in the same way that another person might. Or
heathens change name quite a lot, actually.
Yes, not necessarily ceremonially, but you're right. They do have this tendency to sort of rename themselves.
And they do it like, you have people who come from Iceland, and their calls are like, they have these super Viking-y sounding names, and then they change them to something that sounds even more like, so, yeah,
wolf blood.
yeah.
Something like that. Yeah, things like that. But like, here's a question for you. When people are doing that, do you think that it is coming from something rooted in sort of an animist comprehension, or is it maybe not that deep?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that question.
Okay.
Like, perhaps it sometimes come from something, and perhaps it's just like, man, let me cook up something and call myself Harold. Hoo-ha, Hildetand, blah, blah, blah.
I think the internet probably does factor into that. It's marketability at a level, not every level, but a level. Things like that, or
I mean, part of it is also just like cultural longing. Like, you also find it, I think you find it among many different groups. I think like think about Afro-Americans, North American Afro-Americans, how much
Mm,
they have worked with names in order
mm.
to assert themselves and insert their roots in many,
Yeah,
many different ways. And that sometimes it is as vulgar as these heathens.
yeah.
Let me call myself Zimbabwe KwaZulu, something like that.
Mm.
And but there's a longing towards something going on in there, and that is perhaps in itself, a spiritual element, right? And I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. I think I won't get into it too much, but I mentioned it briefly earlier that a Heavenly Mother is a known figure in Mormonism. There's very
Yeah.
little that is actually said about her, but her existence is acknowledged.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of women, really competent religious women who, for example, come from Mormonism, who don't have space for a religious vocation because they don't have priesthood rights or powers or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and they can find something more akin to that in different forms of paganism. Whether or not that be Wicca or in some sort of
Yeah.
heathen branch, or
Yeah.
there's different ways and avenues for it. Well, actually, especially in the Nordic space, because you have historical evidence of there being female religious figures that are
Mm.
specifically female, or based on certain
Yeah.
assumptions. But um, I think that's very attractive to a lot of women
Yeah.
in Mormonism.
For very natural reasons. Like if you have a religion that basically deplaces women,
Yeah,
obviously people are going to be a little bit like, okay, so
yeah, and I think that Mormonism, and probably other religion or denominations as well, because they have this brand image that they want to keep, they train their members to be really publicly impressive in some ways. These are people that
okay,
have high performing careers. You find a lot
yeah,
of actors that are Mormons, kind of in a way similar to Scientology, where
yeah,
their
yeah,
people become their marketing.
yeah,
So you have, and then you have the Protestant work ethic on top of it. So
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
find a lot of women who are so competent on so many levels, and it's almost like they're overqualified to
yeah,
to just live within the parameters of in this sort of patriarchal infrastructure,
yeah,
and they end up going outside of it to find
yeah,
something else
yeah,
where they can use those skills.
yeah, yeah.
So
I
it
think,
wasn't a thought that was in the forefront of my mind while deconstructing, but at some point it kind of became this thing of like, oh, I could have a religious vocation. I could do that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
No, I think it's a very real thing. I also think that sometimes drives
mm,
huge religious change. Like I seem to remember having read somewhere that um, conversion of women
mm,
may have played a vital role in the rise of Christianity
I've
in
read
the
that. Yeah.
Roman Empire.
Mm,
Like it was basically attractive. Christianity was basically attractive to women,
how the
and
tables
that
have
just made it. Excuse me?
I said how the tables have turned.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And for whatever reasons at that time,
Yeah.
and thank you very much for coming and sharing these thoughts on Mormonism and beyond Mormonism here. Super, super interesting. And just reminding everybody that we'll have Matty on the screen from time to time talking about death and Mormonism and a number of different
Good stuff.
um, interesting issues. So thanks a lot, and check out the Patreon site and the web shop and all that. But and see you around.
Varje kur risar och trött Våknade stridsmän, gaunga och